Seattle rain never rushes. It falls one drop at a time, calm and persistent, as if it had signed a lifelong agreement with the clouds. The scent of coffee from the corner cafe mixed with the smell of wet earth, while the streetcar hummed like the city's morning wake-up call. I'm Elena Moore, 33, an operations assistant at Blue Wave Dynamics. Currently avoiding my third puddle in less than 2 minutes. I've worked here for 6 years, long enough to realize that a positive workplace culture is often just a polite way of saying everyone is worn out. Our company is well known for its rapid growth, and just as well known for having a boss who speaks far more than he ever accomplishes. I've lost track of how many reports I've prepared that other people later presented as though they had written them themselves. But this morning, I didn't have the luxury of thinking about that. I was already behind schedule. As I crossed the parking lot, I noticed a man crouching in the rain, trying to repair what looked like a heavy piece of equipment. His gray uniform was completely soaked, his hands stained with grease, his face so weathered I could almost hear his quiet sigh blending into the rainfall. I paused. Something about the way he moved reminded me of my father, a lifelong factory worker, silent and resilient. I reached into my bag, pulled out my turkey sandwich and the cup of coffee that was still warm, the usual breakfast of people who begin working long before their paycheck makes it worthwhile. "Have you eaten yet?" I asked. "It's freezing out here. Don't work on an empty stomach." He looked up in surprise for a brief moment, then simply nodded. "No thank you. No small talk." Yet there was something in his eyes that made me feel strangely at peace. I walked away, aware I'd just sacrificed a few minutes, but somehow feeling that today was not going to be an ordinary day. As I stepped through the revolving door, Rick Dawson's cologne reached me before I even caught sight of him. Rick, my direct manager, was the type of man who made certain you remembered him, even when you desperately wished you wouldn't. Every morning, he arrived as though it were opening night, his tie perfectly off-center, his hair slicked back until it gleamed beneath the lights. A smile broad enough to deceive an entire shareholder meeting. 10 minutes late, Rick said, his voice echoing across the office like an airport announcement. "You think the world is going to wait for you?" I hung my raincoat over my chair. "No," I answered quietly, "but I think it'll keep turning without me." He frowned and walked away, leaving behind a cloud of cologne powerful enough to make the office plant feel faint. I sat down and switched on my computer. The CPU fan buzzed as though it were complaining alongside me. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, keyboards clattered like one giant heartbeat. Steady, relentless, exhausted. I glanced at my calendar. 10 minutes until the welcome meeting for the new CEO. Rick had been talking about it all week with suspicious excitement, almost as if he were the one being promoted instead of introducing someone else. I adjusted my hair, straightened my blazer, and headed down the hallway. The bright white LED lights reflected off the polished floor, sharp and cold enough to sting my eyes. When the elevator doors opened, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. Wet, exhausted, but still standing. After 6 years here, I'd mastered the art of keeping my cracks invisible. Conference room. 18th floor. 12 people were already seated. Rick stood in the middle, report in hand, his smile stretched tight. He glanced at me with one of those warning looks that seemed to say, if I so much as breathed too loudly, he'd deduct my pay with his eyes. I took my seat at the end of the table, the safest spot in any meeting, far enough to avoid attention, close enough to hear every sarcastic remark. "We're just waiting for one more person," Rick announced, his voice confident and carefully practiced. I opened my notebook and scribbled, "Prepare for self-congratulatory speech." The door swung open, footsteps echoed through the room. I looked up, and my heart skipped a beat. A man entered wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, a crisp white shirt, his hair still damp, as though he had just walked through the very same rain. His eyes scanned the room, then settled exactly where I was sitting, only for a second, but it was enough. I knew he remembered me. Rick didn't notice. He hurried forward with his hand extended, his voice climbing an octave. "Welcome to Blue Wave, Mr. Samuel Cross. We're honored to have you with us." I remained silent. The water glass in front of me reflected the face of the man I'd shared breakfast with. Now he was our new CEO. The room filled with greetings, polished smiles, and rehearsed compliments, but all I could hear was the rain outside, steady and patient, reminding me that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the greatest changes. I don't know where you're listening to this story. Maybe during your lunch break or while driving home through streets full of honking cars. But if you've ever had your own Rick Dawson, someone who confused your patience and kindness with weakness, then you'll know exactly how this feels. Don't worry, the best part hasn't even begun. And if you enjoy stories about clever justice and satisfying revenge, stay with me. And if it's raining where you are, congratulations. You'll understand me better than anyone else. The air inside the conference room felt heavy, like coffee left sitting overnight. Laptops glowed, keyboards tapped, and Rick's cologne was strong enough to qualify as a biological weapon. He stood at the front of the table, shoulders squared, smile stretched wide, the kind of smile designed for cameras instead of people. "I am very pleased to introduce our leadership team to Mr. Cross," Rick said, dragging out every word as though he were hosting a television show starring himself. Every sentence carried a familiar tone, confident, slightly theatrical, with a hint of fear, only noticeable to people who had spent too many years in office buildings. Samuel Cross, the man I had met in the rain that morning, sat at the head of the table without saying a word. Sunlight from the window brushed across the collar of his black suit and settled on his calm expression. I realized his silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone carefully taking in everything around him. Rick continued talking about growth strategy, trend charts, and the sustainability of our innovation ecosystem, phrases polished enough to make people forget to ask what he was actually trying to say. When he reached the section about internal improvements, he tilted his chin toward me. "Elena handles the small technical details," he said. "She's very meticulous, though a little slow." I lifted my head and offered a polite smile. Nobody responded, but I noticed Samuel glance in my direction before looking back down at the folder in front of him. He didn't interrupt Rick. None of us did. We'd all learned that reacting at the wrong moment only guaranteed you'd become the subject of a lessons learned email the following day. Rick finished with a satisfied laugh. "I believe that under my leadership, my operations group is a model of efficiency and team spirit." Anyone who had actually worked with us knew that statement was about as funny as a motivational poster hanging inside a restroom. Samuel placed his pen on the table and nodded once. "Thank you, Rick. An impressive presentation." His voice was calm and steady, neither rising nor falling, yet every word landed across the table like a small stone. He turned a few pages before speaking again, slowly and clearly. "Could you send me the raw data behind these numbers? I'd like to examine them a little more closely." Rick hesitated for a brief second. "Of course," he answered quickly. "I'll have Elena prepare it. She knows every detail." I gave a slight nod, although he never bothered to look my way. I was used to the routine of assigning me the work while taking the credit, but this time felt different. Samuel looked directly at me, only for a moment, but without hesitation. "Good," he said. "I look forward to reviewing it soon." The meeting ended. People drifted into the hallway, exchanging empty compliments everyone knew were meaningless. Rick walked past me, tapping his folder as though he'd just won an award. "See," he said while passing, "presence matters, not details." I smiled and let him keep walking. Presence, I thought. The only thing he has that nobody actually wants to learn. By the afternoon, the first message from the executive office appeared in the internal inbox, requesting that all financial operations and contract records from the previous 6 months be reviewed. I stared at the subject line and felt my breathing slow by one beat. It wasn't fear. It felt more like the familiar stillness before a storm, the kind that arrives without noise, yet washes away everything unable to stand on its own. Rick appeared in my doorway wearing a tight smile. "Elena, I need you to help with a few checks for Mr. Cross. Be thorough this time. Let's not have any mistakes." I looked at him and nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm always thorough, Rick. The real question is whether you actually want the truth." He said nothing. He walked away, leaving behind the scent of cologne and the sharp sound of his shoes striking the tile, as though he were stepping on something fragile. I opened my laptop and began sorting through the folders. In the reflection of the screen, I caught a glimpse of myself stepping into a chapter I had never planned for. I used to believe workplace storms always started with something dramatic, a heated meeting, an accidental CC, or a public accusation in front of too many people. But the truth is, they usually begin quietly,